Yeah, it's not math class if I don't say something about Cami, right? Like Cami. They send me emails being like, "Can you promote our product?" I'm like, "Probably not." So we'll start with fractions and just talk about what a fraction is. So we've done this with pizza before. We're just gonna do some basic ones. So we're gonna split circles into halves, thirds, fourths, fifths, eighths, and tenths. And then we're gonna try to write the decimal value for each thing. So if you look at this first circle, you'll see that they've written fractions inside the circle. So for instance, over here represents 1/2 of a circle. As a decimal, what does 1/2 equal?
0.5.
Yeah, 0.5. On the left-hand side, they've put 2 out of 2, which would mean one whole thing, which would just equal 1. That one's pretty standard. People are usually pretty good with it. If you look to the right, we have this pie. This pie's been broken up into 3 pieces. So if you were looking at one piece of pie, like just this piece, we would call that 1/3. As a decimal, 1/3 is 0.3333, and it keeps going. We represent that as 0.3 with a line above it. A line above a number in math means it goes on forever. If we then considered 2 pieces of this pizza, like this, we would have 2 out of 3, or 2/3. As a decimal, 2/3 would be 0.6 repeated. If you looked at 3 pieces of pie, you would have 0.9 repeated. But if you had 0.999999, we would call that perfectly 1. One whole pizza. The way that we're adding fractions, so we're saying 1/3 became 2/3 became 3/3, we're doing with decimals as well. So if I have 1/3 and it's 0.3 repeated, and then all of a sudden I have 2/3, all I did was add another third. That equals 0.6 repeated. And that's all you're doing. You're adding decimals the same way that you're just adding fractions. 1/3, 2/3, 3/3. Add the decimals gives you the same idea. If we look down here at fourths, it might become a little bit easier to understand what I mean. So if we look at 1/4 of a piece of pizza or a circle, 1/4 is 0.25. If you looked at 2/4, that's the same thing as saying 0.25, which is 1/4, plus another 0.25, which would become 2/4. When you're adding, you are going to have to be able to add without a calculator. Okay, so to add without a calculator, you start with whatever's on the furthest right. I'm going to start with these 5s. 5 plus 5 is 10. So you put a 0 underneath and you carry the 1 up here. You then would add all these numbers. 1 plus 2 plus 2 is 5. The decimal goes in the same spot. And then 0 plus 0 would be 0. That means that half of the piece of pizza is still 0.5, even though we represented it as 2/4. If we went up to 3/4, that's the same thing as having 0.5, which was 2/4, and adding another 0.25. Right? It's adding another fourth. If you were to add that without a calculator, I'd like to put a 0 there after the 5. Normally we don't put 0.50, right? It's kind of redundant, but we're going to put it there just so when we're adding without a calculator, there's a number to add in that column. And I do the same thing. I add this column together. 0 plus 5 equals 5. Then I add the next column together. The next column together would be 5 plus 2 is 7. The decimal goes in the same spot. 0 plus 0 is 0. That means 3/4 is 0.75 as a decimal. 4/4 is just 1. Those are ones that you're all probably pretty familiar with, right? Halves, thirds, fourths. Usually you're pretty good with those. Thirds might have been a little bit that you forgot. A lot of people don't do fifths. So we'll talk about what fifths would look like. 1/5 is 0.2. If you were to do 2/5, that's the same thing as saying 1/5 plus another fifth. So 0.2 plus 0.2 would be 0.4. So 2/5 is 0.4. If I wanted to do 3/5, 3/5 is the same thing as saying 0.4, which was 2/5, plus another fifth, which was 0.2. And that gives you 0.6. 4/5 is 0.6, which was 3/5, plus another fifth, giving me 0.8. And again, 5/5 is 1 whole. So you don't necessarily have to memorize fractions into decimals. If you can just remember what 1/5 is, you could add your way up to anything. So if I said, what would 6/5 be? It would be 1 whole, which is 5/5, plus another fifth, so 1.2. Right? And you can keep doing that over and over and over, and you can convert fractions into decimals quite easily as long as you know what one of something is. All right, it gets a little bit harder with eighths, because 1/8 is not something people are usually comfortable with. 1/8 is 0.125. That'll be the hard one for you to remember most likely. If you asked me randomly, and I'm good at math, and you were like, what does 5/8 equal? I would have no idea. But what I would be able to do is figure out what 4/8 is and then add 1/8 to that as a decimal. So for instance, if I say, what does 2/8 equal? You could say, well, it's 0.125, which is 1/8, plus another eighth. If you add that up, start in the right column. 5 plus 5 is 10. The 1 goes up to the other column, the 0 goes underneath. Then you add the next column. 1 plus 2 plus 2 is 5. Then you add the next column. 1 plus 1 is 2. The decimal goes in the same spot, and 0 plus 0 is 0. That means 2/8 is 0.25. You are going to have to be able to do this stuff without a calculator eventually. We're going to focus more on our non-calculator stuff in the new year, like in the new semester. But it never hurts to start looking at it now to know how to do it. Yeah.
So how do you figure out that it's 0.125?
You're just going to have to know that. Yeah. So there will be, you'll need to know a half, a third, a fourth, a fifth, an eighth, and a tenth. You'll have to know 6 of them. And most people know like 1/2 is 0.5. That's one that people are already pretty comfortable with. 1/8 is not something people are comfortable with. So that's one that you're probably going to have to learn and memorize. If I was to do 2/8 myself, and you actually said, hey, Mr. Kennedy, what does 2/8 equal? I wouldn't do 1.25 or 0.125 plus 0.125. Instead, what I would do is I would take 2/8 and I would reduce it. What could both those numbers be divided by? 2. And it would become 1/4. And I know what 1/4 equals. It equals 0.25. So there will be ones that you can reduce, which makes it easier. But if you looked at 3/8, 3/8 is not one I would have memorized very well. I would know that 2/8 is 0.25. And I would know that 1/8 is 0.125. And I know if I add 2/8 with 1/8, it would give me 3/8. So that's how I would figure out fractions into decimals. And we're going to do a bunch of practice questions like this. So if you added 3/8 together, I would put a 0 in here. That would be 5, 7, 3, and 0 point. Four eighths. I wouldn't add 0.125 to 4 to get 4/8. Why not?
Because it's obvious that 4 is half of 8.
4/8 is 1/2. Both those numbers divide by 4. That becomes 1/2. 1/2 is 0.5. From 0.5 to get to 5/8, I would add 1.125. If I added that, which I'm just going to give it to you, that would be 0.625. 3/8 I wouldn't have to add, 6/8, because I know 6/8 turns into 3/4, which is 0.75. If I wanted to get to 7/8, I would do 0.75 plus 0.125. That gives me 0.875. He's below us. The last one is 8/8. I know 8/8 is 1. That's how I would convert fractions into decimals. Adding up the small value, which I know. Yeah. Maybe next time. You should buy me a pizza. Okay, tenths. Tenths is kind of easy, just depending on how you do it. 1/10 is 0.1. Two tenths would be 0.2. 3/10, I'm just adding another 0.1, is 0.3. Then it's 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, and 1. Again, you could do your adding of 0.1s. The way I actually would do it, and would like you to know how to do it, is kind of scientific. You've probably done it in science before. It's if you take any number, let's say like 97, and divide it by 10. So break it into tenths. All you need to do is take the decimal on 97. So the decimal on 97 is right there. And if you divide by 10, you're moving that decimal one spot to the left. And this would become 9.7. It's the best way to do tenths. Take the number on top, move the decimal one to the left. And that's what we were doing with all of these questions as well. Right? Let's, for instance, look at 4 divided by 10. 4 divided by 10, you take the decimal, you move it 1 to the left, and it becomes 0.4. Dividing by 10 is the easiest one.
If it's 100, you move it 2.
Yeah, and if I was dividing by 100, I would move the decimal 2 to the left. If I was dividing by 1,000, I would move 3 to the left. 10,000, 4 to the left, and so on and so forth. However many zeros there are is how many times you move it. 1 0 means 1 spot. 2 zeros, 2 spots, so on and so forth. Okay. If I were you, I would want to make sure that on this page, I have the first piece of pie memorized for all 6 of those. So I know what 1/2 is, I know what 1/3 is, 1/4, 1/5, 1/8, and 1/10. If you know what those are, you'll be able to do any question. If you can't memorize those, then you're going to have a hard time when it comes to the non-calculator parts. All right, converting these. We're going to do a lot of these together. A, 1/2. We want to convert that to a decimal. I think most people are pretty comfortable. 1/2 is 0.5. 1/3, people are usually pretty good at by this point. 1/3 is 0.3 with a line over it. The line means that you're repeating forever. So it's 0.333333333. Forever, ever. Forever, ever.
What if you found an end to it?
You wouldn't find into it. So if you look at C,
Is there no end? Like, oh.
if you look at C, which is 2/3, if you're not confident in remembering it's 0.6 repeated, which for whatever reason, that's one people remember, what you could do is 0.3 repeated plus 0.3 repeated. That's 2/3, right? 1/3 was 0.3. The other third was 0.3. Add them together gives you 2/3. That means it's 0.6 repeated. This is 1/3. This is 1/3. That equals 2/3. Right? That's the idea of what we're doing here when we're converting to decimals. You don't have to have every decimal memorized. You just need a few and some strategies to add. Two-thirds seems to be when you guys like memorize for whatever reason. Just like sticks in your head. D, 1/4. 1/4 is also called 1/4, which people are usually pretty good with. 1/4 is 0.25. That is one you'll need to have memorized. If I wanted to convert 2/4 into a decimal, you have 2 different options. You could do 1/4, which is 0.25, plus another fourth, which is 0.25, which would give you 0.50. That's one way to do it. 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 2/4.
I just went 2 divided by 4. It gave me that.
In your calculator, yeah, but you're gonna have to do it without your calculator. Yeah. So, like when you have your calculator, it's a good way to check your answers and stuff. Or if it's a calculator part of the test, that's good. But if you don't have a calculator, which for part of the test, we're gonna do some of these without a calculator, and then next in like February, March, April, May, you're gonna have to do a lot more non-calculator. So it's time to start like getting used to it. Yep. Another way to do this is to reduce 2/4. So if you have 2/4, what could both those numbers divide by? 2, which would become 1/2. And people are pretty comfortable with knowing 1/2 is 0.5. All those strategies are legitimate. 3/4. The way that I would tackle 3/4 is I would realize that 2/4 plus 1/4 would equal 3/4. And I know that 2/4 is 1/2, which is 0.5. Plus another fourth, which is 0.25, would equal 0.75. Again, people seem to be pretty good with the fourths. Yep, for sure. 1/5. 1/5 is one that you're going to have memorized. 1/5 equals 0.2. You're just going to have that one memorized. 2/5. 2/5 is the same thing as saying 1/5 plus another fifth. That would equal 2/5. Doing it with decimals, 0.2 plus 0.2 equals 0.4. Three-fifths. 3/5 is the same thing as saying 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2. 1/5 plus a second fifth plus a third fifth, which is 0.6. 4/5 would get a little bit like redundant, and you could do. Just wait, please. Just wait. If you're doing 4/5, you could do 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2, and you would get 0.8. Or with fifths, there's a tricky way to figure it out quickly. The way you can figure it out quickly is by doubling the top and the bottom. So in math, we can get equivalent fractions, right? By multiplying the top and the bottom by the same thing. So if I was to multiply the top by 2 and multiply the bottom by 2, that gives me 8/10. The reason that would be useful is tenths are easy to calculate. 8/10 is 0.8. So sometimes with fifths, instead of having to do all the adding, what you could do is double it to make it a tenth, and then convert the tenth into a decimal, which is a little bit quicker. Yeah, so like for instance, if you had like 0.2, that's the same thing as 0.22 or 2000000, and you can add zeros forever if you need to. And sometimes you need to do that for adding purposes, right? Yeah. Okay, I like that doubling trick with 0.5s. It makes your life usually a lot easier, but sometimes people get confused by it. So if you just want to keep adding 0.2s, works for me.
Wait.
Yeah.
I want to know the trick for 0.8s. The 8 trick.
0.8? Okay, 0.8s are coming.
Not 0.8, but 8s.
Like these?
I don't really get it.
Beautiful. That's okay. Yeah, we're getting those. Those are the hardest ones for sure. The way to do 8s is you have to know 1/8.
Yeah, I know what 1/8.
Yeah. And then we're going to base everything off of that. Okay, so if you don't have the 1/8 memorized, then you're in big trouble. The rest of the 8s are going to break down in different ways.
There is a way that you don't have to actually memorize any of the 1 over something, because if you just take that denominator,
Yep.
and then you say, okay, if you wanted to get it to 10, what do you, how many times do you have to add it to? together.
to get to 10. So like for
And
8,
then divide that by 10. So like with 8, you have 1/8 and then you do a quarter of that 8. You divide that by 10, that's 0.15. That's
oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. I like to think of it like for 0.8, because we're kind of on the same brain track. I think of 0.8 as being half of a quarter. And so if I had a circle, I know my quarters pretty well, right? It's 0.25. But an eighth is what happens when I break everything up into half. And then I think to myself, what's 25 cut in half, which is the same thing you're doing. You're doing a quarter divided by 2. I'm doing 25 divided by 2. 25 divided by 2 is 12.5, which is how I get my 125 as my decimal. To each their own. If I were you, I would just memorize it. I would memorize 1/8 is 0.125. And if one of those methods works for you, that's how you memorize it. If you just need to cold, hard fact memorize it, that's fine too. But the other ones for eighths, I'm always going to try to reduce because eighths usually reduce. For instance, 2/8 reduces to be what? 1/4. Right? So try to reduce eighths. 2/8 turns into 1/4. 1/4 is 0.25. 3/8 doesn't reduce. However, I could break 3/8 up into 2/8 plus 1/8. I've memorized what 1/8 is, and 2/8 reduces. So that means this thing reduces to be 1/4 plus 1/8. Both are things that I know. So this would result in 0.25, the quarter, plus the 1/8 that I memorized, which is 0.125. Give me a total of 0.375. So for eighths, we're either reducing or breaking it up into something that I can reduce. 4/8. 4/8 can reduce. 4 and 8 can both be divided by 4, making it 1/2. 1/2 is one that we know is 0.5. I reduce that by dividing both the top and the bottom by a number. And they both divided by 4. If we look at 5/8, I could never tell you what 5/8 is off the top of my head. It's not one I have memorized, probably not one I'll ever have memorized. But what I do know about 5/8 is it's the same thing as 4/8 plus 1/8. And those are both things I do know. 4/8 is the same thing as saying 1/2 plus 1/8. 1/2 is 0.5. 1/8 is 0.125. And those are numbers that I could add together. That adds to be 0.625. 6/8. 6/8 can reduce. 6 and 8 can both be divided by what number? 2. You divide both of them by 2, it becomes 3/4. 3/4 is one that we do know how to do. It's 0.75. Seven eighths. I have no idea what 7/8 equals, but I do know that I could break 1/8 away and make it 6/8 plus 1/8. That's the same thing as saying 3/4 plus 1/8. And those are two things I do know. 3/4 is 0.75. 1/8 is 0.125. That gives me 0.625. 875. So with eights, we either reduce it or we break it apart into 1/8 plus something else. Eights is definitely the hardest one to convert easily. Tenths. Tenths are easy. All you're going to do is move the decimal place over one spot. So if I have 1/10, the decimal place is right after the 1. I just move that decimal over, so it's 0.1. For S, 2. Decimals after the 2. Move the decimal over one spot, it's 0.2. Third, 0.3. Fourth, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9. Tenths, you're just moving the decimal place over. And that idea of moving the decimal place over is actually going to be how we tackle converting decimals to fractions. Because converting decimals to fractions is harder. Converting fractions to decimals, those are the only ones you'll need to know. Half, third, fourth, fifth, eighth, and a tenth. You won't have to do ninths or sevenths or something crazy like that. Any questions on converting fractions to decimals? All right. So it says to convert each decimal to its fraction equivalent using denominators. Denominator means bottom number of 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, and 10. We're not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to convert decimals to fractions. Okay? And then our answers will coincidentally fit what it asks us to do. Because I think it's a better skill to just know how to convert decimals into fractions. Whether it's a perfect 0.5 or not, I think you just need to know how to do that. So the best way to do it is to use our moving of the decimal trick. So if I want this thing to be a fraction, I'm going to start off by just writing a fraction. I'm going to look at my decimal, and I'm going to take the decimal spot, and I'm going to move it to the right until it's no longer a decimal. So if I moved it to the right, I would now have 0, 1, which would be 1 on the top. However many times I moved it to the right is how many zeros I need to put on the bottom. So for instance, I only moved it once to the right, so it's 10. Make sense? Kind of weird? Okay, the next one's a little better example. So I want to convert this to a fraction, so I make it a fraction. I want to move that decimal until it's all the way to the right. So I need to move it 1, 2, 3 times. Because I moved it 3 times, I need to have 3 zeros on the bottom. So I would be dividing by 1,000. On the top would now be the number 125. That thing that I just created has to be reduced. Okay, so I have 125 divided by 1,000. Both of those can be divided by something. Some numbers might be more obvious than others, right? This one can be divided by 5 pretty easily. So if I divide by 5 to the top and bottom, on the top, 125 divided by 5 is 25. On the bottom, 1,000 divided by 5 is, whoa, I almost said 100, is 200. And then you might be able to reduce again. In this case, it's getting a little easier to know how to reduce. 200 can divide by 25. 25 can divide by 25, which gives me an answer of 1/8. Now, if you're really good with your decimals and your fractions, you might have just remembered 0.125 is 1/8, right? Which is maybe a little bit easier. But when you get more complex numbers, or if you're just out in the real world and you're trying to convert something into a fraction for whatever reason, if you just move the decimal place, it'll always create an easy fraction, which then you can reduce. So for instance, if we had 0.2, 0.2, to turn it into a fraction, I would move the decimal one spot over. That means I need to divide by 10. On the top would be the number 2. Those are two numbers in which I could both divide by 2. Gives me an answer of 1/5. Again, you might just know 0.2 is 1/5, and that's fine. But if you don't, that's how you can convert it and then reduce it. 0.25. You might just know 0.25 is 1/4, which is awesome. Or you could move the decimal 2 to the right, which means I have 25 on the top, and I divide it by 2 zeros, so 100. And then you can reduce that. 25 and 100 both divide by 25, giving me an answer of 1/4. Point 3 might be one that people are like, I don't know what that is. Right? The best way to do 0.3 is to take the decimal and move it over. On the top, I would have 3. On the bottom, I had to move the decimal once, so there's 1 0. 3/10 cannot be reduced. 3 can't divide by anything. 10 can divide by 2 and by 5. But because 3 couldn't divide, that's your answer. Have you guys seen moving the decimal to make it a fraction before? Some people are nodding, yeah. Some people are like, no, never seen that. Yeah, it's an easy way to turn into a fraction. You have to get good at reducing fractions, which might make it a little trickier. But at least then you started with a fraction, right? And then you can work your way from there. 0.3 repeated. That one's not going to work when we try to move the decimal over. The reason it's not going to work when we move the decimal over is because 3 repeated should go forever. So you're going to move the decimal forever, which makes no sense. It's not going to work out. This is one that you're just going to have to know. 0.3 repeated is 1/3. .375. If you had it memorized, awesome. If not, converting that might be a bit of a mess. To convert it, we take the decimal, we move it 1, 2, 3 spots over so that we have the number 375 on the top, and we divide it by 1,000. Anything that ends in 25 or 50 or 75 can be divided by 25. So if you look at 375, because it ends in 75, I know I can divide this thing by 25. It might take me some counting to do it in my head, but I know it's going to happen. And 1,000, because it ends in 00, I know can divide by 25. To reduce 375 by 25, or divide it by that, you just need to count by 25s. 25, 50, 75, 100. 125, 150, 175, 200, 225, 250, 275, 300, 325, 350, 375. It's 15. I lost my pencil though. There we go, 15. Divided by 1,000. If you count by 25s, that works as well, but it's going to be 250. Oh, hold up. I divided by 4. My apologies. It's going to be 40. $15 over 40 can be reduced again. What numbers can both of those be divided by? 5. Giving me a final answer of 3 over 8. There's some ugly dividing in there. Right? Like dividing by 25 isn't fun, and numbers like 375 and 1,000 can be intimidating, but they're really not as bad as they look. You can skip count by 25s most of the time to get to the numbers that we need. Otherwise, converting 0.375 is hard. You might have to have that memorized to make it easy.
Wait, so if you just have it memorized, then that's all right?
Yeah. Yeah. Like if you've memorized all your decimals, yeah, that's good. Works for me. But I just worry that eventually you'll get a question which you didn't have memorized, then you won't have the skills or a strategy. So at least now you have a strategy for when you get one that you're like, holy, I don't know what that is. Right? And this strategy will work for any decimal, as long as it's not something crazy like a repeating 3. Right? We don't know how to deal with repeating 3s other than memorizing them. 0.4. If I was to do that question, I'm moving the decimal 1 over. So I have 4 on the top, and I have to divide by 10 because I moved it once. 4 and 10 both divide by 2, becoming 1 over 5. 0.5. 0.5 is one that probably people just have memorized. Right? It's 1 over 2. However, if you didn't know that, you move the decimal 1 over, you now have 5 over 10. Both of those divide by 5. You have an answer of 1 over 2. Looking over here, we got a few harder ones. I'm going to go a little faster. 0.6, I move the decimal 1 over to become 6 over 10. Those both divide by 2 to become 3 over 5. 625, not a very fun one. If I move the decimal 3 times, 1, 2, 3, it's now 625 divided by 1,000. Reducing that, again, isn't going to be the most fun. This does divide by 25. I know because it ends in 25. 1,000 divides by 25 because we already did it, but it also ends in 0, 0, which is good for me. On the bottom, I'm going to have 40. On the top, if you're not sure, you could skip count by 25s. Another way to divide by 25, especially when you're doing hundreds, is actually to think of it as money. So this might throw people off for a second, but you guys are usually good with money. So instead of thinking like 625, I would think of $6.25 and ask myself, how many quarters would I need to make $6.25? And most people could actually answer that question. But if I said, what's 625 divided by 25, people couldn't do it. Each dollar is 4 quarters. So I have $6 in quarters, 6, 12, 18, 24, plus 1 more quarter means 25. Maybe that helps you. Maybe it doesn't. But when you're dividing by 25s, you're talking about quarters, right? Quarters is money. Sometimes people, especially if you're a cashier, if your part-time job is doing that, quarters might be really easy for you. 25 and 40 both divide by 5. Become 5 over 8. 0.6, you're just going to have that one memorized. That's 2/3. Anything repeated is going to be divided by 3 in this class. So I'll make your life a little easier, I guess. Yeah, man. 0.7, move the decimal 1 over. That becomes 7/10. You can't reduce that. That's your answer. 0.75, move the decimal 2 over. That becomes 75/100 because I moved it twice. Both of those divide by 25. That gives me an answer of 3/4. 0.75 you just might have memorized. That's one people are usually good with. 0.8, move the decimal 1 over. That gives me 8/10. Both those divide by 2 to become 4/5. The last one, second last one. Probably the ugliest one. 875. I'm going to move it 3 to the right. 875/1000. And then I'm going to divide by 25s. $875 divided by 25 isn't a good one. You're probably just going to have to skip count or do the money trick, $8.75. So if I have $8.75, 8 times 4, 8, 16, 24 is 32, plus 3 more quarters is 35. That is a lot of quarters. Divided by 40. 35 and 40 both divide by 5 to become 7/8. The last one is 0.9. Move it 1 over, becomes 9/10. And that cannot reduce. All right. The reason why that might be useful is this decimal trick. Is if you got a number like this, I'm just going to come up with one, actually better yet, 3.25. When you get a whole number like that, sometimes people have a hard time converting it into a decimal. But the trick we just learned would still work. So if you take the decimal, move it 2 to the right, that thing as a fraction becomes 325 divided by 100 because I moved it 2 to the right. That is something I could then reduce. Both of those divide by 25. That means I would have 4 on the bottom and 13 on the top. So if you ever are in that situation where maybe you have something you don't have memorized, you could move the decimal and then use our trick. If you have them all memorized, cool. Even better. Awesome.